keratin bond users, and guys, totally from experience, screw up a lot is what I did.
Yeah.
Screwed up a lot to figure this out. But I also had some thin-haired clients that were determined to keep hair on their head no matter how bad I was at it. And there wasn't a lot of competition when we first started. So I had to get good at it, or I wanted to, and they wanted me to. So as I kept trying to get better at it, I think her name was Deborah, actually. She was like, Bernard, these lasted a little longer than last time. What did you do different? No clue. So I'm like, I'm looking really
I got
hard.
good. That's what happened.
I'm trying to figure it out. And I'm noticing that I put a little more hair. And then I started realizing over time, we talk about some of these things, but we don't put them together. Like people who are finer and thinner go through the shedding process faster. So if somebody is shedding hair faster, now, you know, it's so many hairs on the head, roughly what, 100,000 hairs. So if somebody sheds 50 hairs a day and regrows them, then you're not really losing hair. You're just replacing hair. But
Recycling.
they're
Yeah.
right. But people who are getting thinner, even as thick as my hair is, that is thinner than I was 10 years ago. I used to have a lot more hair per square inch, right? So even if I'm losing, I didn't thin much. I used to have no hair in the tub or shower. And now over the last couple of years, I see a little hair in there. So I know I'm losing a little bit more. So I was probably shedding like I don't know, 10 hairs, 5 hairs a day, and I just didn't even see them. Now I'm shedding more. Let's say 20. Oh man, I bumped the screen again. Let's say I'm shedding 20 hairs. I'm probably not regrowing 20 now. I'm regrowing 18 or 19, you know? And so I'm slowly regrowing less hairs than I did before. And that's what we're doing with age. As we're shedding hairs, more hairs per day. As we get older, we regrow a few less of them. And that's how we end up a little thinner when we get older. Does that make sense?
It makes so complete sense. And that's just the process, and that's how it goes. You could try to do things to try to prevent that. You could try to do things to improve it and all that. But at the end of the day, that's what's happening. What a lot of people don't realize is you don't get to control or dictate which hairs shed. So if you've got that attached to a hair extension, to that section of the hair, and that section of the hair is part of some of the hairs that shed, that attachment point is going to become weakened. And if you don't have enough hair already in there, that extension's coming out. That area, that attachment area is falling out.
So that's what I learned on Deborah and every other thin hair client from then on. So then it became common practice for me to realize with somebody with fine, thin hair, I would have hairdressers say, should I use a half bond instead of a whole bond on her? I'd say, you know what? I have better success with whole bonds. And they're like, on thin hair? And I'd say, well, this is what I do. So let's think about a whole bond. I had a guy count one time. How many hairs are in a typical strand of extensions? Do you know how many hairs are in one?
33.
No, over 100. And so this guy tells me in a class.
Sat there and counted individual strands of hair.
This is a young, good eyes. And I remember in the class, I said, so when we talk about extensions and how many strands to hook one bond to, I don't know how many are in a strand. And one guy goes, about 117. I said, I thought he was joking. I looked over and he goes, I counted them. I'm like, what?
Okay.
He said, I counted a few and 117 was the average. Woo, good for you, dude. So I always used to say about 50 hairs. I was totally guessing. I was half off. So if you're going to have about 117 hairs, let's just call it 100. If you have 100 hairs in a bond and you're going to connect it to a person's head, the first thing you should be thinking is I should connect this to 100 hairs. Yeah. But 100 of the same size, same strength hairs. Because if a person has thicker, coarser hair, 70 or 80 hairs might hold 100 hairs of a little bit finer, thinner hair. They'll blend together fine.
You're saying, yeah.
Yeah, so it's more about if you could measure the size of the ponytail, the teeny tiny little ponytail. That's what you're trying to match, having the same strength holding it. So if you take a client with finer, thinner hair, it might take 150, 175 hairs to hold 117 hairs of extensions. So if I take one little 100 strand hair and put it on the client, if I take the normal size section I take, which would normally be about 100 hairs from practice and experience, on a fine thin haired client, I go a little wider. So I'm actually pulling a little bit of an angle because I usually take a square the same size as the bond. I go a tiny bit wider and a tiny bit deeper. And that adds 30, 40 hairs to my section and brings it up to more hairs to support the weight. So when I do that on a 100 strand keratin bond to hold, and I'm getting 120, 30, 40 hairs to hold 100 hairs on a fine thin haired client, if I were to cut it in half and do a half bond, well, now I'm at 50 hairs and I do a little bit bigger section. You would think it would be apples to apples, but it's not because that smaller section, when that 50 hairs sheds down to 15 or 20 hairs, it's a really weak bond, and that's where some damage comes in. But if I got a 100 hair bond in 150 and 40, 50 hairs shed, I've got better support on the full bond. That's just through experience. I was just figuring this out because I would do some half bonds on the side, half bonds up high, bigger bonds down low, trying to make the ones that were more visible. Those were the ones I'd have more trouble with. And so through experience, I started figuring out that the whole bonds held better when I did a little bit better, bigger section on fine thin clients. And I was just trying to figure out, like, why would that be? And I think it has to do with the shedding. Obviously, there's no way to 100% know, but of course I had my angle just right. I had a good solid keratin bond. I heated it twice, rolled it or folded it really, really good. Had a good technique, good company I'm dealing with between Great Lengths, and then to move to She Hair a few years later. And those little details, lots of little details. Good clean hair, rinsed really well, no products.
So excited! You are so excited right now.
It was like so much to learn over the years.
Isn't that discovery like the best feeling ever? Is when you start to realize, like, oh wow, I'm starting to get it. It's starting to make sense.